Hello and welcome to the fourth webinar in our series for REACH 2018 registration. My name is Adam Elwan and I will be your moderator. The infographic you see on your screen shows an overview of all the phases needed for a successful registration. You can find these phases explained in detail on the REACH 2018 pages on our website, together with key information, guidance, and other support material. Now let's recap what we've already covered in our previous webinars. In the first webinar, we described how to identify which substances in your portfolio need to be registered before the 2018 deadline and how to move forward with your preparatory activities. The second webinar explained how you can find your co-registrants and start preparing to work together. The third explained how to get organized with your co-registrants through Substance Information Exchange Forums, or better known as SIFs. These webinars have been recorded, and you can find them on our website and our YouTube channel as shown on your screens. Today's webinar will focus on the type of data you need to collect for the tonnage you want to register, what you should do before generating new data for your substance, and how to fill in any data gaps. The webinar program should be visible on your screens. We will start with a presentation on information requirements for your registration, followed by a second presentation on how to fulfill them. After that, we will show you a video where we asked our stakeholders to share practical advice for registrants preparing for the 2018 deadline. We will also be showing you a role play demonstrating potential situations you might face when preparing your registration dossier and setting up your testing strategies. We will then conclude with a Q&A session where a selection of the most recurring questions received by ECHA on this topic will be covered by our expert panel. You can submit your questions through the Q&A panel, which should be visible in your webinar window. During the webinar, our panelists will answer your questions through the live chat. We expect many questions and may not be able to answer all of them during the webinar. If your question is not answered, you can submit it to your National Help Desk or to the ECHA Help Desk. Their contact information is available on our website, and you can find them using the link visible on your screens. Remember that you can maximize the small video window, which should be visible in the top right corner of the screen, by double-clicking on it with your mouse. Pressing the Escape key on your keyboard will return you to the normal view. This will be particularly useful during the company interview video, the role play, and the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If you experience any difficulties with the webinar tool, you can contact our technical support team also through the Q&A panel. This webinar will be recorded and published on our websites shortly after the event. All the material we present to you today is available on the 2018 registration web pages, which you can find from our home page. I now hand over the floor to my colleague Catherine Cornu, who will talk about what information you need in order to prepare your registration dossier for substances you produce or import in quantities between 1 to 100 tons per year.
Welcome everybody to this webinar. My name is Catherine Cornu and I work on registration matters in ECHA. In this short presentation, I will set out phase 4 of our plan for a successful registration by 2018, following on from the data sharing activities we went through in the previous webinar. I will explain the basic principles here, but step-by-step instructions and answers to frequently asked questions are available on our website. There are 5 key activities in this phase of your preparations for registration. You need to understand your information requirements, gather hazard data and fill data gaps, then agree on classification and labeling in the SIF, the Substance Information Exchange Forum. You need to gather information on the uses of your substance and assess the risks and your risk management measures. I will briefly explain these 5 activities, and afterwards my colleague Andrea will explain how the steps 2 to 5 can be approached in practice. Let's start with briefly introducing the terminology we will be using in this webinar. Hazard means the intrinsic quality of a substance to cause harm to the environment or to someone's health, such as explosiveness, bioaccumulation, or genotoxicity. Risk is the likelihood of that harm occurring. Risk is the product of the hazard and the exposure. Hazard is usually determined by standard tests, and the exposure is estimated from the use of the substance throughout its life cycle. The assessment of hazard and risk is crucial for achieving the main aims of REACH, which is to show that you know your substance and the hazards of your substance, and that the risks posed by your substance are controlled and the substance is used safely. Your first activity in this phase of your preparations, which we already briefly introduced in the previous webinar, is to understand which data you need for registration, which depends on your tonnage band, and if you will do a standard registration or a registration for an intermediate under strictly controlled conditions. For the registration of an intermediate substance, you only need to supply the data you have available, so you are not required to buy additional data. For a standard registration in the 1 to 10 tons per year band, you need a set of physicochemical information and some toxicological and ecotoxicological information. The list of information requirements shown here is also available on our website. You can see that for a standard registration in the 1 to 10 tons per year band, you will normally need 1 test on vertebrate animals. In the next presentation, you will hear what to do if you did not do these tests in the past, since under REACH, performing tests on animals is the last resort. Alternative methods need to be considered first, and you will have to demonstrate that you have done that. If your substance is a low-risk substance, then you can register your substance in the 1 to 10 tons per year band by providing only the physicochemical information. The list of substances which we at ECHA believe are not low-risk substances is published on our website. This list was put together using models to predict toxicity and contains 65,000 substances. And lastly, for a standard registration in the 10 to 100 tons per year band, you will need to provide still more ecotoxicological, and toxicological information on the substance, in addition to the information needed for the registration in the 1 to 10 tons per year band. The next step is to gather the hazard data you have, and you will hear more about this in the next presentation. And then evaluate the data, identify data gaps by comparing the data you have to the information requirements, and determine in the sieve if you need to generate data for your registration. We have prepared a practical guide for SME managers and REACH coordinators, which explains each of the information requirements in a few pages, indicating also which expertise is needed to assess and compile the data, to help you make a decision if you need to outsource certain parts of this work. And this guide will be available in all EU languages on our website. At the end of this activity, you, collectively, in the sieve, need to have a complete set of good data that satisfies the information requirements for your registration. Next is classification and labeling. The obligation to classify and label all the substances you put on the market stems from the regulation on the classification, labeling, and packaging of substances and mixtures, with the aim of ensuring clear communication of the relevant properties of substances and products to those who come into contact with these substances. Most likely you have already notified your classification to ECHA's classification and labeling inventory. Now you need to agree collectively in the sieve on the classification and labeling based on the available hazard information. Remember that agreement does not necessarily mean that there can be only one. You can agree on multiple classifications and labelings for the multiple compositions of the substance covered in the registration, for example, caused by different impurities or forms. In parallel to gathering hazard data, you also need to gather information on how your substance is used in your supply chain, from the manufacture or import through formulation, use at industrial sites, use by professionals and consumers, all the way to its end of life. As most of you are also downstream users, this is a good point in time to remind you that as a downstream user, you have to support the registrants so that your critical substances will be registered and your uses will be covered in their registrations. As stated here on the slide by one of the company experts who has been active in the ECHA stakeholder exchange network on exposure scenarios, downstream user sectors should join forces and develop use maps so that registrants get relevant information on uses and conditions of use in a harmonized format, so that at the end of this activity, the registrants have the information to conduct chemical safety assessment if needed. The last activity of Phase 4 is to assess the risk of the substance from the hazard and the exposure. If you find that the risk exceeds the safe limits, you need to implement risk management measures and define conditions of use so it becomes safe and recalculate your risk. If you manufacture or import your substance at 10 tons or more per year, you will need to document your chemical safety assessment in a chemical safety report, or CSR. The CSR will also be part of your registration. You need a CSR also if your substance is not classified. If your substance is classified, your CSR needs to include an exposure assessment and exposure scenarios describing the conditions of safe use. After this, you have all you need to prepare the content of your registration dossier. Remember that registrants of the same substance have to register jointly. The lead registrant will have to submit his registration first, but all registrants need to submit a registration to register their substance. The hazard data, meaning the physicochemical properties, toxicological and ecotoxicological data, goes in the dossier of the lead registrant, although all co-registrants are responsible for the content. The classification and labeling is also reported in the dossier of the lead registrant, and the generic description of the substance agreed by the CIF. You can, under certain conditions and if justified, submit some of this data separately, meaning in the own registration dossier rather than in the dossier of the lead registrant, which is called opting out. Each of the co-registrants for the substance need to submit their own registrations, which contain the identity of the substance, as we discussed in the Phase 1 webinar, including the own concentration ranges and impurities, and the uses and conditions of use in the own supply chain throughout the life cycle of the substance. The chemical safety report can be submitted jointly by the lead on behalf of the whole CIF, or it can be submitted separately by each co-registrant, so this is a choice to make in the CIF. If you are joining a CIF and buying a letter of access for a substance that is already registered, it is important that you check that your substance fits the generic description of the substance, and if there is a joint CSR, that your uses and conditions of use are covered. So we've now talked about all 5 key activities of Phase 4 of your plan for registering by 2018, and I will conclude with a few messages for you to take away from this. It is important that you understand your information requirements so you can build a complete and compliant dossier. Remember that completeness is checked by ECHA when you submit, before a registration number is assigned. So if you submit an incomplete dossier, you are putting your timely registration at risk. If your substance has already been registered and you will be a member of the joint submission, it's still important to understand your information requirements so you understand what you will be joining and you can make sure that you do not pay for data you do not need for your tonnage band. If you find that data is missing for your registration, remember that you need to agree in the CIF on how to generate the information. Consider carefully the hazard information you gather or generate in the CIF and your exposure information. Some of this information may be new to you, and you may have to rethink the risk management measures you have in place to ensure you and your customers use the substance safely. You may also have to update your safety data sheets. And remember that support material is available from your National Help Desk and from industry associations and from the ECHA website by clicking on the REACH 2018 banner. This concludes my presentation for today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Catherine. Now my colleague Andrea Ghisi will talk about how to fulfill these information requirements in practice.
Welcome to the second part of this webinar. I'm Andrea Ghisi and I work in the Computational Assessment and Dissemination Unit in ECHA. We heard my colleague Catherine talking about what information is needed for your registration. In this presentation, I will talk about how to collect or generate the information you need. As seen in the previous presentation, these are the 5 points presented in this phase 4 of the REACH 2018 roadmap. Understand your information requirements, gather hazard data and fill data gaps, agree on classification and labeling within the CF, gather information on uses, and assess risk and risk management measures. I will not cover step 1, understanding your information requirement. For this, I advise you to have a look at the material on our REACH 2018 web pages for phases 1 and 4. We have prepared this material to support you in concluding what information is needed. I will mostly focus on hazard information and in particular alternatives to animal testing. But I will also give you some tips about other information such as classification, uses, and risk assessment. This slide explains the steps to satisfy your requirements about hazard. Collect all available information, consider information needs, identify missing information, and generate new information. First of all, REACH states that you collect all available information about your substance, regardless of the requirements. Data could be available in your company, external scientific sources, or external reports. As a second step, you have to consider the information needs, which will depend on your tonnage band. But keep in mind that the requirements for the highest tonnage band in your CF have to be covered in the joint part of the registration. Once your needs are clear, you can identify missing information, also called data gaps. Remember that there is the obligation of sharing data within the CF, that the data you use needs to be of sufficient quality, and that sometimes data from substances similar to yours can also be useful to your registration. I will talk more about the so-called read across in a moment. Finally, if you have identified data gaps, you need to generate new information. REACH states clearly that animal tests must be used as last resort. But remember that if you want to use an adaptation in place of an animal test, then you need to prepare a scientifically sound justification for it. Next, I will explain adaptations in more details. We have just said that animal tests should be avoided whenever possible, and that REACH promotes data sharing and adaptation to this end. But we can't forget the protection of human health and environment. This is why adaptations need to be justified before ECHA can accept them. For instance, we hear more and more about computer models that can predict toxicity. But the predictions of these models are not always reliable. It depends on the substance. So you need to include in the dossier a justification explaining why you consider that a prediction specifically for your substance is reliable. REACH defines the rules to use adaptations. These are specific rules, called like this because they are specific for each endpoint or property, and general rules. The specific rules are listed in the column 2 of REACH annexes 7 to 10. One example of such rule is the possibility to omit the skin sensitization test if your substance is already classified as corrosive to the skin. The other type of rule for adaptations are the so-called general rules. They are called general because they are not specific for a certain property, but can be used to adapt any information requirement. you can use adaptations when testing is not scientifically necessary or not possible, or when you can demonstrate that there is no significant exposure to your substance. In the next few slides, I will show you definitions and examples of adaptations that can be used when testing is not scientifically necessary. The first adaptation I want to describe is weight of evidence. Weight of evidence is the use in combination of several independent sources of information. It is particularly useful when a single piece of evidence is not sufficient to fulfill the information requirement, for instance a non-standard test, and you have other evidence to support the result. Or if individual studies give conflicting results. In this case, an expert needs to assign weight to the different lines of evidence and make a conclusion. Chesars, quantitative structure-activity relationships, are computational models that predict endpoints using chemical structures as input. It is better to use them for predicting simpler endpoints, such as physicochemical properties, because their results are less reliable when predicting more complex properties. They are also useful when the substance is difficult to test, like in case of low solubility. Note that we have recently updated ECA's practical guide on Chesars with examples and useful tips. In this practical guide, you will also find a list of software, and some of them are free, that you can use to predict the different rich endpoints. Another type of non-animal tests are the in vitro, performed in a controlled environment such as test tube or petri dish. Suitable in vitro data can be used as standalone adaptation or as a part of weight of evidence. For some endpoints, in vitro are now the standard information requirements, in column 1 of the annexes, and not adaptations. Neutral red uptake is an example of in vitro test that can be used as an adaptation for mammalian acute toxicity as part of weight of evidence considerations. The last adaptation I will speak about is read-across. Read-across is the use of data from one or more substances to fill a data gap for another substance. Usually it is used when you do not have data for a specific endpoint for your substance, but you have good quality experimental data from a substance that is very similar or relevant to yours. It is extremely important that you submit an adequate justification whenever using read-across, as for any other adaptations. After the adaptations, let's have a look at some tips useful when you assess hazard information. It is important that you carefully plan your testing strategy. For instance, if you know that your substance is used in solution and is unstable in water, you may need to test the properties of the degradation products. Or, if you know that there is an inhalation exposure to your substance, then you have to take this into account when planning the testing strategy, because an inhalation test might be needed. Be aware that the hazard information you submit has to cover all the compositions in the joint submission. You will hear more about it in phase 5 of this roadmap, where we will introduce the new concept of substance identification profile and boundary compositions. Another advice is to use the Chesar Toolbox software. It's free. ECA and OECD develop and update it. The Chesar Toolbox can be used for most of the steps we have seen in this presentation today. Retrieve experimental data, find similar substances, build category of substances, and predict properties using read-across and Chesars. Classification and labeling refer to the hazard of your substance. As Catherine mentioned, you should have already classified the substance because of the requirements of CLP regulation. But the classification may need to be revised over time. In fact, if there is a harmonized classification for your substance, you must use it. And if more data become available, you may need to change the classification. Try to agree in your CF about the classification, but remember that some substances may have different classification because of, for instance, different impurities. We have seen so far how to gather data about hazard, but information on uses is also crucial for a correct risk assessment. A good source of information on typical uses and conditions of use are the sector use maps, which you can access from our website. You should also check the data available in your company and contact your customers to find out how they are using the substance. Once you have collected the data, you can prepare the information for your registration. It is important that you cover only the real uses relevant to your supply chain. In Euclid 6, the format to report uses has been improved compared to the previous version. We will explain how to report uses in Euclid in more detail in the webinar for Phase 5. Related to uses, we developed the software Chesar. It is a tool that we recommend to use when you need to perform a chemical safety assessment and prepare a chemical safety report. It also helps in the preparation of exposure scenarios. We advise to use Chesar for several reasons. It is free, it prepares CSAs in a harmonized way, and it is able to exchange data with Euclid to ensure consistency and easier updates of your data. Now that we have talked about how to assess hazard, classification, exposure, and risk, we can conclude with some key messages. Always consider alternatives before generating new data. In fact, various adaptations exist. Generating information is a joint effort of the CF. Collect information on uses from the sector organizations of your customers as a starting point. Remember that testing and preparation of the dossier takes time. And finally, to conclude my presentation, take advantage of ECA's tools and support. Use the link on our website that you see in this slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. If you have any questions related to Catherine's and Andrea's presentations, you are welcome to send them using the Q&A panel visible in your webinar window. We will answer as many of them as possible through the Q&A panel. Don't forget that if your question is not covered by the end of the webinar, you can always submit it to your National Help Desk or to the ECA Help Desk. Next, we move on to our video with best practice and tips from our stakeholders.
I think they have to start with the guidance on the ECA website. That's the best place throughout Europe to go for a starting point. It's not that there's a lack of information available once you're aware that you need to do something about REACH.
There's so many different kinds of issues that you have to take into consideration. And mainly for the small companies, it's no use to learn everything yourselves. So it's better to use people that know what they are doing.
And the best advice would be if you don't have all the people who know all the toxicological things and ecotoxicological, is to hire a good consultant and be comfortable with your consultant and make sure that you can trust them to do a good work, and also that you feel that the work that they do for you is sort of applicable to you.
Universities can be good. There are a number of consulting companies available. You can also start discussions with your suppliers, also with trade associations who operate on your behalf. They can be a number of sources of help. Remember that many aspects of analytics are confidential, but trade associations often know how to bring these together in a non-confidential way.
When you are self-confident and you know that you know the REACH regulation, you can rely on external consultants, on the CIF itself, on the lead registrant, or on the secretariat of a CIF, and this means that you can keep under control other people working together with you or instead of you.
Start early and seek good advice. Even if you have to pay quite a lot for it up front, that will pay for itself in the long run. So do it once and do it right. The second thing is look at column 2 adaptations and annex 11 carefully, because if you use those two correctly, you can save yourself a lot of time and effort. And finally, you should base your dossier on good science. Use data where you have it. Don't just say, I'm going to claim this and not give a reason. It's really important that you justify everything in detail.
Now, the situation is there's not a lot of consultants out there. There's not a lot of test houses that are geared up to do this. They're all going to get very busy, and if you don't start now, you could find yourself in a few years' time where you're desperate to do a registration, and the backup that you need is just not there because there physically is not the capacity.
because it seems to be a long time to 2018, but it takes a long time to prepare dossiers, especially for companies starting with this issue. It's much more easier for companies registered 2010, 2013. They are more aware of it. For new companies, it's a lot of work. They have to look for guidances. They have to look to Euclid. Everything is new for them, so they have to start up to now, yeah.
1 year was the highest one. So I would say like an average between 3 and 6 months. I couldn't tell that this is real for every substance because the time depends on the substance, if it is hazardous, if it is easy to find a consortium and so on.
Availability of the time is a key component, and also if anything goes wrong, I'm not thinking about tests going wrong, but more your substance is not what you think it was. Your substances are more complex, UVCB rather than a single substance.
This again depends if you are registered individually. If you are the only one registering, then it can take a year or two to do it if you have to do everything yourself. But if you join a joint submission, then it depends on how fast you actually can get this substance identity done for you. So you have to show what your substance is and to which sieve you will belong, and then this is what takes the longest. So it can take a few months.
For 1 to 10 tons, you don't need a lot of testing. We talk about 30,000 euros for testing for these substances, but you have to go to other companies, you have to go to meetings, you have to organize it. For smaller companies, you have to hire a consultancy. It depends on existing data, it depends on competitors. Can you share the cost with other companies? It's very difficult to answer.
Perhaps, well, it's difficult to say what the main cost will be because usually it's the letter of access to the dossier and the data that is causing the most of the cost, but that can vary. So it depends on how many companies are involved, how many are in the sieve, and what kind of substance you have, how much studying and how much testing is needed.
In 2008, we found out that there was a lack of information on how our chemicals were used in the market. We have trying to find this information, but apparently from what we learned after the registrations in 2010, 2013, we were confronted with criticism from downstream users that they were not finding back their uses in our registration dossiers, in our safety data sheets and the exposure scenarios.
I have sometimes users you are not aware of that are not fully communicated in the supply chain and things like that.
In order to solve this problem, we have been exploring much more on how we can look now at this extended use maps in order to combine the two obligations that we have, we as manufacturers to describe the uses and downstream users to end up that they recognize easily that their use is covered in our registration dossiers.
So registrants have to know as far as possible realistic conditions to assess the chemicals and the uses in their registration dossiers. With the use maps, registrants get in a harmonized and very well structured way all the information they need to create their dossiers. Downstream users should really benefit of the existing templates. They should make use of them, populate them as soon as possible, because registrants are really now rushing towards the 2018 deadline, and thus downstream users may make sure that their uses are really covered.
The worst thing that can happen is that every single downstream user is contacting every single manufacturer of that substance. Again, this is indeed one of the reasons why we have been inventing this use maps in order to facilitate a better and streamlined communication in the supply chain.
They are a lot more useful and a lot more detailed than previous guidance, and we will be encouraging people to look at them.
Continuing with practical advice and examples, we now move on to the role play. Let's wait a few seconds to make sure that you all have the video loaded before starting. Remember that you can double-click on the video window to view it in full screen. Okay, ready to start.
My name is Eva Valkovičová and I work in the Evaluation Directorate of the European Chemicals Agency. The roleplay you are about to watch will illustrate a few typical situations that you may encounter during the data gathering process for your registration. In 6 scenes, we try to simplify the main steps that the company may need to take to gather and analyze the data on their substances needed for registration. Before starting, there are some ideas I would like to share with you. Companies registering the same substance must work together to share and compile information on the uses, hazards and risks of their substances in order to demonstrate their safe use. By being well organized, you can achieve the goal to register chemical substances at the latest by 31st May 2018. There are 5 key activities of your preparations for registration. You need to understand your information requirements, gather hazard data, work together in the Substance Information Exchange Forum, so-called SIF, to fill data gaps and agree on classification and labeling. Then you need to gather information on the uses of your substances and assess the risks and the risk management measures you have in place. If new data needs to be generated, alternatives to animal testing must always be considered first. I have invited some of my colleagues who will be representing the following roles: Company Director, Company REACH Coordinator, National Help Desk, REACH Consultant. In this roleplay, the Company Director and the Company REACH Coordinator agree on the best strategy to register in time 2 substances that they have identified as subject to the REACH 2018 registration deadline. Let's start.
Good morning. Yesterday I watched ECHA's 11th Stakeholders Day and I realized that we should start preparing for the registration. I really don't want to miss the deadline in 2018. What are the steps that we have to take?
Morning, boss. You see, that's exactly what I tried to tell you about half a year ago, that we have to start working on it. And in the meantime, I already started spending some time when I had some spare time of mine, and have managed to find the list of pre-registered substances from 2008. And I'm hoping that it's still a complete list for us. And also mark those substances that we will definitely have to register together with the tonnage bands we will register them for, and have started to collect the data what we have on them in-house.
Okay, but ECHA says it only takes 6 steps to make it.
That is correct. It's only 6 steps and they have already presented 3 of those. And I've watched all the webinars, so I'm more or less in picture of those. And essentially what we have to do is we have to make sure that we know exactly the substance identity for our substances. We have to find our co-registrants, those who are also registering the same substance, and we'll have to agree on data sharing with them and also on who's going to take the role of the lead registrant.
Okay, what about the money? How much is it going to cost?
That's a very good question, which seems to be what everyone's asking around, and no one seems to have a definite answer on it, because it very much depends on a lot of different factors. And also importantly, I don't think I'm going to be able to do all the work on my own, as at some point it becomes quite scientific. And I was looking at ECHA's website. They have a lot of information on it, but I'm not so sure where to start.
What about the help desk? I understand ECHA has a help desk that could provide some information.
They do indeed, but I think we have to start with our national help desk.
Well, all right, let's do that then.
Getting organized for REACH 2018 registration needs to be a priority in your company. If you have followed the roadmap phase by phase until now, you have already gone through the preceding steps and you have already made a list of substances you need to register. You checked if they are already registered by someone, you know who the other registrants for your substances are, and whether there is a lead registrant. Your tonnage band is clear and you are aware of what information you need to submit. If you have not started yet, you should do so now, as it takes time to collect all necessary information. You also need to reserve time to analyze the information you collect, either from existing sources or by generating it.
Anisat National Help Desk, good morning.
Good morning, my name is Istvan Mag. We have pre-registered our products in 2008 and we're now trying to understand what we will need to do to register them under the REACH regulation. And I have quite a number of questions. I hope you will be able to help us.
Sure, it's good that you're taking the first steps towards the registration process, as it can take quite a long time. But may I ask you a few questions first?
Yes, of course.
Is the tonnage band of the substances that you manufacture or import between 1 and 100 tons per year?
For most of our substances, yes, it is, but in a few cases, it's just a few hundred kilos.
Okay, then you would need to register only those above 1 ton. And do you know the chemistry of your substances?
What exactly do you mean by chemistry?
Are they mainly simple or more complex, like reaction products, for example?
I think they are mainly simple substances, but this is something I will have to check with my chemist. I'm going to write it down.
I think now I have a better understanding of your situation. How can I help you further?
Well, the first thing is what we want to know is how can we get some help, as we're quite a small company and we have doubts that we'll be able to do everything on our own.
Well, you might have experts in your company and you can also check with other registrants for support. And you might also consider outsourcing part of the work. For example, consultancy companies can prepare your registration dossier, and crawl labs can provide you help with the testing and the analysis. And we also heard that industry associations can offer sector-specific advice and support.
Oh, that sounds very good. But what about consultants? Where can we find a good one? Would you have any advice on that?
Well, the first thing you should do is to check the ECHA website. There you can find a checklist for hiring a consultant. And then you should contact the consultant and test their competencies. And also be prepared to properly assess their answers. And industry associations can also provide you with a list of well-known consultants with good references.
Great, but how can we be absolutely sure that the consultant will be able to do all the work before the deadline in 2018?
Well, a consultant should tell you their capacity, both in terms of providing advice and support and carrying out the work. And you need to check that they can carry all the tasks that you are not able to do in the house. And also make sure to check with them their time availability in order to complete the tasks. And don't forget that the ECHA 2018 roadmap can help you define what is needed to be done.
Oh, thank you so much. That was very helpful.
You're welcome. Bye.
Goodbye.
A REACH help desk is established in every member state. They provide answers to your questions in your national language. The ECHA help desk can be contacted especially for questions on submissions and ECHA's scientific IT tools. You may also contact industry organizations for sector-specific advice. And certainly talk to your co-registrants, the CEF members. Go into your REACH IT account to find the companies that pre-register the same substance as you and contact them. Do not reinvent the wheel. They may be experienced already with REACH. And of course, also our website and webinars are here to advise you.
Hi, so I called our national help desk and they told us that we'll have to gather some more information before we get to a consultant.
What sort of information?
Well, first of all, we'll need to determine what information we already have in-house on our substances and also to see if there are any other registrants planning to register the same substance.
Okay, but at least for two of our substances, Helsinki phenol and ECHA aldehyde, we are alone. I think we should start with those two. We will need a consultant later on anyway.
You're right. Have you read the document I sent you? It is the practical guide for SME managers and REACH coordinators. It was very useful to help us preparing the registration dossier.
I have read it, yes, I have it here, and I must say it's quite easy to understand, even for me, with little knowledge when it comes to REACH. If I understand correctly, the requirements are not the same when it comes to Helsinki phenol, which we produce 4.5 tons per year, and ECA aldehyde, which we produce 33 tons per year.
Did you notice that in the practical guide it said that we will also need to provide information on where our substances are used? So I think we will need to gather market information from our end users.
I think the advice was to see whether our customer sectors have already done this for us. Apparently there is an ECA webpage where we can check if they are available. They call them user maps, I think. And then we need to prepare this chemical safety report based on the information.
Yes, but we only need to write a chemical safety report for aldehyde as to demonstrate that every use is safe, because we are producing that above 10 tons a year.
All right. Well, let's make a list of requirements for our consultant, shall we?
Yes.
To gather data for registering your substance, you need to follow these 4 steps. Collect all available information. Consider information requirements, identify what you are missing, and generate new information. Agree with your co-registrants how to divide the work. Remember that to achieve good quality information, you need to be clear from the beginning on what the substance identification of your chemical is and what is the proper name as set out in the ECA guidance for substance identification and naming. We have prepared a practical guide for SME managers and REACH coordinators. It explains each of the information requirement in a few pages, indicating also what expertise is needed to assess and compile the data. This should help you to make a decision if you need to outsource certain parts of this work. And this guide will be available in 23 EU languages on our website. A good source of information on typical uses and conditions of use are the sector-specific use maps, which you will be able to access gradually from autumn 2016 onwards from our website. You should also check the data you have available in your company and contact your customers to find out how they are using the substance. Consider outsourcing the work if needed. You are responsible for your registration dossier, so do not wait for someone to do it for you. Follow the work of the consultant and the lead registrant, and remember that jointly submitting the registration is a shared responsibility.
Good morning. We would like to register 2 substances as lead registrant under REACH, and will require external support to put our registration dossiers together. We would like to discuss whether you can take our project on board.
Well, I'm quite busy, but let's see what kind of help you would need. To start with, I need to know the number and composition of the substance you want to register, then your tonnage band to determine which information you will need to submit, how many registrants are part of the joint submission, and also what information you can gather already within your own company.
Our substances are specialty substances and we want to protect our exact compositions. Is it enough to tell you the type of substance?
I'm afraid you will need to tell me the composition, but in our contract it will be stated that I won't share the exact compositions with the other companies.
Okay, we have 1 substance below 10 tons a year and another one above. What information should we gather in our company?
You need information on many properties like PhysChem results, possible impact on the environment, and also human health data. For the substance above 10 tons, you also need detailed information on conditions of use for all users you will cover in the chemical safety assessment. I can go through these with you and develop your inventory of information. If additional tests are required, you need to book them as soon as possible, because for some of them there is very low capacity left in the contract labs.
Okay, understood. We don't yet have the inventory of all information available, but we just found the practical guide for SME managers from the ECA website, which describes all of these.
Well, yes, that's a very good start. Then for certain endpoints, you need to go a bit deeper in reading. There are more precise guidance documents available.
I searched in the chemicals database on ECHA's website and I found plenty of data. Can we use them in our dossiers?
Well, did you notice the legal disclaimer? You can't just copy the data, you can only use it if you have the permission from the data owner.
Right, okay. But another question. I already know that we will need a 28-day study. Can we do it in January 2018? We will only have the money back then.
That will be too late if you want to submit in March 2018 as a lead. The sooner you start, the better for you and the better for your co-registrants.
I see. What about using alternative approaches to get the data? In this ECHA guide for SME managers, it said something about Chesars and read acrosses. They sound complicated but interesting enough if we can avoid any tests performed.
Well, this is what we need to do together if we now agree to set up a contract. Alternative approaches are very substance specific and their use depends on the available data.
Okay, I see. Well, that sounds good. As we were saying, we would need you to help us develop an inventory of what information we already have and what are the data gaps depending on our substances, tonnages and properties.
Great. Based on our discussions, I can prepare the contract for our cooperation and I can make a plan for filling any data gaps and a reasonable timeline to ensure the dossiers are ready before March 2018.
Be prepared, understand REACH, and know what your information requirements are. Always have in mind that animal tests should be avoided whenever possible. REACH promotes data sharing and adaptations, but the protection of human health and the environment is always first. This is why adaptations need to be justified before ECHA can accept them. REACH defines the rules to use adaptations. There are specific rules, which are specific for each endpoint or property, and are listed in column 2 of REACH Annexes 7 to 10. The general rules are not specific for a certain property, but can be used to adapt any information requirement. You can use adaptations when you can demonstrate that there is no significant exposure to your substance, or when testing is not scientifically possible. New testing on animals may also be scientifically not necessary if you can obtain suitable data using existing data and alternative approaches. To better promote the use of alternatives and the principles of animal testing as a last resort, we are publishing a practical guide on how to use alternatives to animal testing to fulfill your information requirements for REACH registration. We trust that this will help you to make the best use of the opportunities that REACH offers and will provide a good support for your business decisions.
Alright, let's talk about Helsinki phenol, the substance that we have 1 to 10 tons per year.
We have gathered our internal information available in-house, including analytical data, boiling point, water solubility, and flammability. We have the overview of uses and exposure, but we haven't asked our customers about all their end uses yet.
Good. So I see it's a well-defined monoconstituent substance. To identify which information is missing, we need to do some literature search, consider computer models, and data from similar substances. I can start with that. In the meantime, you should request any existing data from companies who have pre-registered a similar substance.
By the way, I was just contacted last week by another company, so we will now start a discussion with them to see if we can use their data and if we can become the lead registrant.
So we really need to do all these steps first before we can decide to generate new data and to contact the lab to carry out any missing tests.
Last time, by the way, you mentioned that these Chesar models are substance specific. I guess that now we could actually consider using them. So what about for tests like surface tension, vapor pressure, or acute toxicity?
Yeah, well, yes, there are valid models for these 3 tests.
But wait a minute, in the guide for SMEs, I read that for surface tension, there is no reliable Chesar.
Okay, I haven't noticed that before. In any case, for the 2 other tests, the models always have to be used together with other sources of information. This way we can show that the information covers the same aspects as the normal tests. This is called adaptation to the requirement and always requires some consideration by a technical expert.
So we just need to perform the test if it is quicker and cheaper. You told us that we're late anyway.
I did, but at the same time you as registrants have to always consider other approaches first before doing testing on animals. Animal tests should only be done as a last resort, and this is what we are assessing here. As I was saying, we could also consider information on similar substances and build a scientific argumentation. There is information on this in ECHA's guide on how to use alternatives. But I think we can now start to implement the strategy we discussed so far. Is there anything else you would like to discuss?
For a standard registration in the 1 to 10 tons per year, you need to fulfill the information requirements as set in REACH Annex 7. You need a set of physicochemical information and some toxicological and ecotoxicological information. This list of information requirements shown here is also available on our website. You can see that for a standard registration in the 1 to 10 tons per year band, you will normally need one test on vertebrate animals. Since under REACH, performing tests on animals is the last resort, alternative methods need to be considered first, and you will have to show that you have done that. To understand more about the computer models that can be used to predict the properties of chemical substances, we recommend you to have a look at the practical guide on how to use and report the quantitative structure-activity relationships, so-called Chesars.
Okay, time to check how we are progressing. How far are we with our dossier for ecaaldehyde? Time is going so fast.
For ecaaldehyde, we need to collect more data as we are above 10 tons a year. We also still need to collect information on uses from our downstream users and are thinking about using the sector use maps.
Yeah, and we need to discuss the results of the in vitro tests for skin and eye irritation.
Yes? Is there a problem?
Well, not really a problem as such. The results show that the substance is an irritant, but they allow us to classify accordingly, as required by REACH. The positive side is that we do not need to do any more tests on animals.
But what about this test called Screening Reproductive and Developmental Toxicity Study to see the effects on the next generations? We have no other alternative but to do that test, do we?
Here we will have a problem with timing. To find a time slot is quite... Excuse me, do you mind if I respond? Good morning, this is John speaking. How can I help you? Yes, sure, we can help you find a contract lab. Sorry? I don't think I heard that correctly. Did you say you need to start testing today? For a screening study? No, the first available time slot is in 3 months, I'm afraid. Yeah, that's right. The availability is getting low. My apologies, I'm with a customer right now. I will call you later. Bye. Well, as you can see, we are already running late. So where were we? Oh yes, be aware that for tests like this, if the results show that there are severe harmful effects, we may need to do more tests.
More animal testing? But if they are not listed for our tonnage, surely we don't need to do them.
Yes, but if the results are not sufficient or inconclusive, you need to consider performing further animal tests, which are normally required for substances in higher volumes. Anyway, before conducting such a test, you first need to submit a testing proposal to ECHA and wait for them to approve it. Only after that, you and the co-registrants can actually go ahead with performing the test.
But if the labs are occupied, it will take ages. Can we continue selling our ecaaldehyde before we get all these results?
Well, this is why we are hurrying to find the best solutions for you. Remember, we still have to look if we find data on similar substances. That way I can try to build a read-across case. ECHA has published quite a lot of advice on how to do this and even on how they check them. This is really not an easy road because we need to demonstrate that the substances are truly similar and would have similar effects in humans and the environment.
Okay, well, we'll let you evaluate the best scientific option for our substance. We can review it a bit later. And don't forget to let us know what other information you need for the dossier preparation. By the way, for users, we have contacted the 3 associations that are relevant to see if they can provide any necessary information.
Great. Then we should have everything covered. So I'll see you in 2 weeks. We should try to be as thorough as possible at this stage, because a good quality dossier is less likely to require extra data if ECHA picks it up at a later stage.
For a standard registration in the 10 to 100 tons per year band, you will need to provide still more ecotoxicological and toxicological information on the substance, in addition to the information which are needed for a registration in the 1 to 10 tons per year band. After collecting all the information, the last activity is to assess the risk of the substance from the hazard and the exposure. If you find that the risk exceeds the safe limits, you need to implement risk management measures and define the conditions of use so it becomes safe, and recalculate your risk. If you manufacture or import your substance in amounts of 10 tons or more per year, you will need to document your chemical safety assessment in a chemical safety report, or so-called CSR. If your substance is classified, your CSR needs to include an exposure assessment and exposure scenarios describing the conditions of safe use. To help you carry out your chemical safety assessment and prepare your chemical safety report, ECHA has developed an application called Chesar, which is available free of charge from the ECHA website. We have now summarized all the steps to be taken to assess the hazards and risks of your chemicals. As a take-home messages, let me reinforce the importance of understanding your information requirements so you can build a complete and compliant dossier. Remember that completeness is checked by ECHA when you submit before a registration is assigned to you. So if you submit an incomplete dossier, you are putting your timely registration at risk. If your substance has already been registered and you will be a member of a joint submission, it's still important to understand your information requirements so that you understand what you will be joining, and you can make sure that you do not pay for data that you don't need for your tonnage band. If you find the data is missing for your registration, remember that you need to agree in the CIF on how to generate the information. Have in mind that animal testing shall be the last resort. Carefully consider the hazard information you gather or generate in the CIF and your exposure information. Some of this information may be new to you, and you may have to rethink the risk management measures you have in place. You may also need to update your safety data sheets. Your main aim is to make sure that you and your customers use the substance safely.
I hope you found the examples useful. You will be able to watch the video again after the webinar on our YouTube channel. Now it is time to start our question and answer session. I will be joined by Eva Valkovicova, George Cartledge, and Andrea Gissi, who will answer some of the most recurring questions received on this topic. So, let's move on to the first question. We hear everywhere that animal testing should only be used as a last resort, but the REACH annexes list a lot of animal vertebrate tests. So how should we proceed with compiling a registration dossier for 10 to 100 tons?
Adam, maybe I'll take this one. I think we have to give a bit of background. So the main goal of REACH is to ensure that producers and importers understand what the properties of each of their substances are, and that they can use their substances in a safe way which minimises the risk to the human health and to the environment. So this means that information has to be generated on the effects of their substances. And REACH lists the information that the registrant has to require, and this includes information from tests in animals. At the same time, REACH puts emphasis on avoiding unnecessary animal testing, especially if it involves vertebrate animal testing. So REACH is the balance found by the legislator to try and balance these different aims.
And I would like to also add that the data sharing obligation that we discussed in the previous webinar was introduced to REACH exactly for this reason. So not to duplicate the same testing, and the registrant need to share the existing studies, and also to agree who will perform a new test if needed.
Yes, and data sharing is a very good way to avoid animal tests, but if the data are not available at all, there is still a chance to avoid animal testing by using alternative methods, alternative to the use of animals. As we have seen in my presentation, there are many of them recognized in REACH. SAR and QSARs, quantitative structure activity relationships, read across and grouping approaches of similar substances, in vitro tests, which can either be the standard requirements or can be combined with other information, and weight of evidence, where these lines of evidence are combined together. We have just published 2 guides which will help registrants in fulfilling this duty of considering alternatives. One is on how to use the alternative methods, and the other one is specific on QSAR models.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, there's a follow-up probably for you, Andrea. In your PowerPoint, you presented QSARs as an alternative. Person is asking, can they be used for everything?
Well, in my presentation, I've mentioned a series of adaptations, including QSARs, which fall under the general rules, in principle applicable to any property or endpoint. But I also stress that ECHA cannot accept adaptations if they are not properly justified. And experts would agree with me if I say that for more complex endpoints, we do not have yet models which are able to capture all this complexity and give reliable results. That's why we advise to use QSARs in weight of evidence consideration. It is also very important to understand that using a scientifically valid model does not mean that the prediction will be accepted as such, because we want a specific explanation and justification for the specific substance you are predicting.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on then, I'm registering for the 10 to 100 tons, and there seems to be quite a lot of tests involved. The person is asking if there's any way to reduce the number of tests.
Adam, so the registrant should, together with an expert, build a smart testing strategy for your specific substance. In the strategy, you might plan which order to perform the tests, based on the assumption that one test may affect the need for another test. And this helps you save time, and sometimes it can help save money, which is important. It also helps to avoid unnecessary animal testing. So, to give an example, if you have needs of an acute oral toxicity study and a repeated dose toxicity study, you might consider using an integrated testing strategy, which you can find in ECHA guidance, which might mean you don't need the acute oral toxicity study per se, and this might save animals and costs. And in the best case, ECHA's estimated that you can fulfill the information requirements for the 10 to 100 tons registration level with only 3 vertebrate animal tests.
Continuing from that, then also we normally advise registrants that in case they decide or they conclude they need to generate new information, then this it's better to consider to hire a specialized laboratory to do, of course, these tests, because the methodology of the test needs to be appropriate, and it also needs to be a relevant test for the substance.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, there's a related question. Since you just mentioned the words appropriate and relevant, is this related to information of good quality? If not, what does good quality information really mean in practice?
Yes.
Adam, maybe I'll take this one. So these 2 terms that you mentioned, there are actually 3 criteria for data quality in REACH. The information that you provide has to be adequate, relevant, and reliable. So there are 3 criteria. So adequate means that the person reading your information has to be convinced that you have met the REACH information requirements. So for example, if you provide a study, it has to fulfill all of the criteria in the respective test guideline. Relevant means that you provide information about the property that's requested. It sounds rather obvious. If it asks for a water solubility test, then we might expect to see a water solubility test and not something else. And then finally, reliable means that the information is based on a source that can be trusted. And you can assign a quality standard to this on a scale of 1 to 4. So for example, if you have a test done according to a standard test guideline with good laboratory practice, this would be assigned a high score of 1. If you have information that you find elsewhere, and you have no information about the study design, then this gets a lower score, and the score might be 3 or 4 depending on the source.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to justifications for adaptations. You mentioned that all adaptations need to be properly justified. Could you explain what a proper justification contains and what would be needed to convince you?
Okay, maybe I'll take this one, Adam. So all adaptations have to be scientifically justified. Reach starts with the assumption there might be a test, and if you move away from that, you need to have a good justification. Now, the adaptation possibilities are specified in the REACH annexes. So for example, some are specified in column 2 of the REACH annexes, and these lay out the reasons on which you can adapt the information requirements so you might not have to provide the test. And there are other adaptations, and these are in Annex 11, and these again specify the conditions under which you might adapt the information requirement for a test.
Yes, here actually I would like to add, because very often in the registration dossiers we see, for example, for the technically not feasible, the registrant states that it is technically not feasible to perform this test. And this is actually not fine on its own, because we would want to see also the scientific justification. Why is it not technically feasible? And similarly, if the registrant is using a read-across or a Chesar, this requires even more elaborated scientific justification for the read-across, even the scientific hypothesis why this is relevant, why is it relevant for this substance and why it can be used.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on then, someone is asking, I noticed that in the REACH annexes where information requirements are defined, it is sometimes said that I need to consider further testing, like in the endpoint for short-term toxicity to fish. What does this mean in practice?
Well, in practice, for example, for this specific endpoint for the short-term toxicity to fish, it means that it depends on the substance itself, because if the substance is of a low water solubility, then the registrant may consider to do first the rather the long-term test than the short-term. And in that case, though, the registrant need to submit a testing proposal first to ECHA before the test is even performed, and the registrant needs to wait for the ECHA's decision whether the test can be done or not. And this is to ensure that the generation of information is tailored to the real information needs, and it's also to avoid the unnecessary animal testing.
Maybe I can add that this is relevant for other properties as well, such as mutagenicity or repeated dose toxicity testing. For mutagenicity studies for substances at 10 to 100 tons per year, if one of the 3 in vitro tests that you have to do gives a positive result, then you need to prepare to test in vivo, even though these tests are normally only required for substances imported or produced at higher volumes than at your registration. These are the tests described in Annex 9 and 10. As Eva said before, before such a test is performed, you need to submit a testing proposal to ECHA, and this is because the tests are more complex or more expensive or use more animals, and it's only after ECHA has accepted your proposal that you and the co-registrants can go ahead with performing the tests.
Okay, so am I understanding correctly that for these tests, the registrant would not do the tests before actually submitting the registration?
Yes, correct. Yes. As we said, one has to include the testing proposal into the registration dossier, and then ECHA will assess this testing proposal. First, we will have a public call for information on the property for that substance, and assessing then afterwards the scientific validity of the testing proposal. And then ECHA, together actually with the member states, we even approve or we modify or we reject the testing proposed. And in this way it is shown whether the testing is necessary or not.
Okay.
And remember, during this time, you're legally on the market whilst you're waiting for the ECHA decision. Mm-hmm. And maybe one final message we could give on this is that before registrants conduct or propose new tests in vertebrate animals, they have to consider alternative methods and use them where possible. And it's good practice to record these considerations that you make about the alternative methods. And in fact, these considerations are part of a testing proposal that you must submit along with the testing proposal. It's compulsory.
Thank you very much, George. Moving on to the need for a chemical safety report. You mentioned several times that the chemical safety report for registration above 10 tons is needed. What do I need to do if I register in the tonnage band of 1 to 10 tons?
So, for this tonnage band, you don't need a CSR, that's correct. But you still need to submit some information about the uses and exposure, as is pointed out in REACH Annex 6. So in practice, what we advise is to complete a proper use description in Euclid. In the same section, you can also indicate and justify absence of exposure, if relevant. Opposite to those registration where you need a CSR, in this case you don't need to have an attachment to your dossier.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea. Then moving on to changes in annex requirement and sharing existing data. My substance was already registered in 2013 and I have to join the joint submission with a tonnage of 1 to 10 tons per annum. The lead informed me about the existing data package for sharing. It contains in vivo studies for 3 tests, and these 3 tests are the skin irritation, eye irritation, and skin sensitization tests. Now, based on the changes in REACH Annex requirements, I should provide only an in vitro study. So the person is asking, am I obliged to share the existing tests on animals? Can I use them, or should I run the in vitro tests instead?
Well, first of all, the lead registrant cannot oblige you to share or buy the in vivo data, as they are not part of your formal requirements. However, you may find it beneficial using those data because you already have certainty in the findings in the results of the studies. So if the test is already available, then you can of course use them in the registration. And indeed it applies for the 3 tests that were mentioned, so the eye and the skin irritation and the skin sensitization.
Okay, thank you very much. Opt-outs from the joint registration were mentioned in the presentations. Person is asking, what are they and on what basis are they actually possible?
So there needs to be a valid reason to opt out from the information submitted jointly in the joint registration. And there are 3 possible kind of scenarios when a registrant can opt out. And it would be that you do not agree with the choice of the data made by the lead registrant, or then the data in the joint dossier is disproportionately expensive to you, or that submitting the data jointly would lead you to disclose confidential information. But in all these cases, the registrant needs to provide a valid justification for choosing to opt out.
Yeah, and if I can add something on opt-outs, I think it should be emphasized that they are done per property. In other words, you need to consider and justify your opt-out for each and every property in the joint part of the dossier. The default is clearly that you submit jointly, and that's what we expect. In fact, we may select a dossier for compliance check because of the opt-outs.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving now to a more general question. What type of expertise is required for pulling a registration dossier together?
Well, to pull a registration together, you need a broad competencies. And in short, we could say that you need legal expertise to understand REACH and your requirements, administrative expertise to cope with Euclid and data sharing and the CF, also scientific and technical competencies for the ecotoxicological part, and knowledge of the IT tools, Euclid, REACH IT and Chesar toolbox. Of course, this expertise can be shared within the CF. We don't expect each co-registrant to cover all of this.
Yes, indeed, and then it is also known that not every registrant can really do all these things on their own. So we do recommend that they use consultants to prepare the registration dossiers. Then also the testing, of course, needs to be done in the laboratories. And what we have heard is that as the REACH 2018 deadline is coming closer, that the laboratories are highly booked. So we do recommend the registrant to start to prepare the registration dossier already now. And then maybe one last remark I wanted to say, that there we have the REACH 2018 webpage. and that can be used as one-stop shop that directs the registrant to the information that they need to know to prepare a good registration dossier.
Okay, thank you very much. That's about all the time we have for the Q&A session. Thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you for joining us. We hope you found the information useful, and remember, you can always contact either your national help desk or the ECHA help desk for further information. Thank you. We are reaching the end of the webinar. Thank you for joining us, and to our panelists and presenters. If you do not receive an answer to your question by the time the webinar ends, please resubmit it to your national help desk or to our ECHA help desk. Remember that you will be able to find a recording of the webinar and further support material on the REACH 2018 web pages. As mentioned at the start of today's webinar, we have already covered knowing your portfolio of substances, finding your co-registrants, and sharing data. Once the data has been exchanged within the CIF and the information on uses, hazards, and risks has been compiled, the lead and the member registrants need to submit this information to ECHA in the form of a Euclid dossier. The next webinar in the REACH 2018 series takes place on 4th of October 2016, and it gives you an overview of the basic concepts of Euclid. We will also cover how to enter data into Euclid, validate the data, and create a dossier which can then be submitted to ECHA. The webinar will be suitable for beginners and for users that have already worked with the tool. You can already register for this webinar on our website. If you haven't already done so, remember to subscribe to our news from the ECHA homepage to stay up to date. Did you find the webinar useful? When the webinar closes, you will be automatically redirected to a short feedback questionnaire. Please take the time to share your comments and suggestions with us so that we can further develop our webinars to meet your needs. See you again in October.